Heavenly Father, today we put on the full armor to protect us against attack. We put on the belt of truth to protect against lies and deception. We put on the breastplate of righteousness to protect our hearts from the temptations. We put the gospel of peace on our feet to walk in your light, peace and freedom with the Holy Spirit. We rebuke anxious thoughts. We take up your shield of faith for protection to block and destroy all the darts and threats thrown at us by the enemy. We put on the helmet of salvation to cover our minds and thoughts, reminding us that we are children of a mighty King. We are forgiven, set free, saved by the blood of Jesus. We take up the sword of the Spirit, your living word that has the power to demolish strongholds and is sharper than any double-edged sword. We come to you in prayer daily. In Jesus' mighty name, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Hey, you guys. Welcome to another episode of The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today I'm honored to introduce to you someone I have learned so much from, who I believe has one of the most important voices on the planet right now, Svali, aka Svali Speaks, for those of you who follow her online. Some of you may know her online from her Svali Speaks blog or her Svali Speaks book collection she's authored. And here's one of the books that she's had that I've had the honor of reading. Svali broke free from her group several years ago. She used to be a programmer in the cult, and now she wants to share the knowledge that she has to help others. It is possible to break free of cult abuse if a person is involved. It's a long, heartbreaking process, but well worth it. All in the consent she has publicly provided and made easily accessible to all. She hopes to help the survivor of cult abuse find tools to help in their journey towards freedom. Svali, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Well, thank you for having me too. I appreciate it.
It's such an honor. I'm more recent to learning about you over the last few months whenever I reached out to you, and I immediately went and bought your book, Breaking Free of Cult Programming. And it just had the most tremendous impact on me. You know, it's like, it's not easy learning about these topics, but for somebody like me who's passionate about learning and who's never personally experienced it, something such as programming or cults, it's like I have my own idea of what that could be, but your readings and your book and your blog have just been key in accelerating my learning. So I'm absolutely honored to having you on here. And I think a lot of people listening are going to be able to connect those dots themselves on some of these topics. So for people who may not have heard of you or who may be new to your story, can you give us some background and insight on your upbringing and your backstory?
Okay, I'll do it briefly. Well, when I was in my early 30s, I started to remember my cult abuse. Before that, I was amnesic. I went through quite a process of working through memories. At that time, I was searching for someone who could help me understand what I was going through, even though I was in therapy with someone who had information and knowledge about cults and programming. This was in the mid 1990s. They didn't know much. And when I started to share with them my stuff, they said, "I've never heard of this." And I remember saying, "Well, how do I break free from it?" And they said, "Just abreact." I'm like, oh my lands, and I wanted validation too. And that's why I wrote my first blog, because I was really seeking, I knew others would go through what I was, and I want them to have the validation I couldn't find. And while I had support from several people, it's been a long journey. At one point, I spent 2 years with a friend of mine in Texas, did some intensive time of journaling, prayer, basically worked on my own pretty much with God's help. And my friends that were supportive, they gave me a safe place. Tons of memories started coming out then too. And eventually, I knew enough about my system to get a good understanding of what programming was in place. Over the years, I've struggled to get free. I've struggled with a lot of harassment as I did so. There have been a couple times when I did get sucked back in. It was very traumatic. It was very terrible. And then I had to work twice as hard afterwards to get free again. And so my book, It's Not Impossible, is based on that, because I realized that sometimes when a person has complex programming, it's easy to think there's no way you can get out. There's no way to get free. And that's not true. People do get free. It's not easy always. And I go into some of the reasons why, on my blog, if you read it. But my main desire is to help people find a source of help and truth. Um, I want to encourage people not to give up. I want to encourage people that I'm a strong Christian, and for me, that's personally a source of help. That if you can find enough love in your life, I found it in God's love and my friend's love, but if you can find that and enough safety, it is possible to heal. Yeah.
Thank you so much
That's
for
the.
that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I really encourage people to read your blog, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But as someone who is extremely knowledgeable on mind control, would you mind giving us the history, backstory of mind control programming and its use in secret societies, such as, I'll use a common one, the Illuminati?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm gonna correct something. Um, I'm not all that knowledgeable on mind control because anyone raised in any of these sophisticated cults is going to have quite a good grasp of programming. These groups teach their children to become programmers from an early age. So anyone who's been raised in any of the 12 big occultic societies has a pretty extensive knowledge of mind control from their experience and also doing it to others. The difference is not every survivor is willing to discuss mind control for various reasons. It could be fear of retaliation or other things. So I just considered myself a person who is willing to talk about it more than as an authority, if that makes sense. Well, you know.
It does. It's more for people like me, and I know a lot of the listeners, it's kind of a 101 to we look at you as the ones who are going to help educate us. So to us, you're super knowledgeable, but that makes a lot of sense that there's a lot of
Yeah.
people across the planet that have the, extensive
Oh
knowledge.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The history of mind control. Well, how much time do you have?
As
um,
much time as you need.
well, let's see. Mind control has been around probably ever since the first secret societies. I'm thinking back to ancient Babylon when they had rituals and people were sworn to keep something secret. I'm talking about biblical times. Probably even back then, there was some amount of mind control, but it's not the same as it is today. Historically, up until the early 1900s, mind control is mainly rituals. In other words, the ritual itself was the mind control, and the mind control was a ritual for many secret societies. So that might be something where you have a child who's hung in a well, and it's told, we won't bring you up unless you promise never to tell, or being buried alive, or the child is taught how to build a wall, using I'm sorry, I'm being graphic too, by the way, but using human bodies as a mortar to build the wall to create amnesia. Those are ancient rituals that have been around for thousands of years. And that was probably the type of mind control you saw until the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, a shift started, though, in which the focus became not just doing the ritual, which was effective in fragmenting a child and getting them to keep the secrecy, but into more of a scientific mind control or modern mind control. And starting around 1912, the emphasis became on, people started to ask, how can we make this better? And that's a difference between modern mind control and ancient mind control. They started using the scientific method to look at behavior, attachment, because basically mind control is a manipulation of a child's need to feel safe or to have attachment in order to get a desired result. I mean, you can basically, those are the two things, because in most mind control methods, they will take away the child's feeling of either safety, or they will threaten them with abandonment or lack of love to coerce them in, or the destruction of loved ones, which is a form of destruction of attachment in order to get the child to do what they want. So starting in about 1912, you start to see your behavioral scientists like B.F. Skinner and some of the others introduce operant conditioning, and that became part of mind control. Then fast forward to the late 1930s, early 1940s, and that's when Mengele and some others were also investigating mind control as well. And in fact, in Nazi Germany, Mengele was doing much more extensive experiments than have been ever documented, but that's a whole other topic that I'm not going to dive into right now. He's considered the father of modern programming by many groups because he collected extensive databases then. He collected databases on what he called endpoint experiments, which was to see what the limits of human tolerance for certain things were, and endpoint meaning death, either psychological or physical death. And then after Mengele, of course, and at the same time, the Japanese also were also doing huge mind control experiments. People don't talk a lot about that, but the Asian societies and the Japanese were also doing similar things during the World War. Afterwards, programming became more and more sophisticated. You saw programs like MK Ultra developed in the United States for its mind control, or the MI6, the greenhouse over in the UK, which actually had children at greenhouse being trained and taught to. You had other mind control programs around the world then starting, or either starting or else continuing in a more sophisticated level. So government came in, and also the military came in too with they call them MyLab or military lab program and indoctrinated mind control. Then in the 1970s and 80s, they started to develop high-tech programming, which are machines like virtual reality machines, holograms, high-tech torture, the use of EMF, of different bursts of microwaves and things. They also, at that point, the occultic groups were able to actually, you may have seen some PET images of the brain. Well, the cult had access to technology like that about 60 years ago. And after like the 70s and 80s, they were actually mapping out the human brain, the emotion centers, the thought centers, and the consciousness center, so that they could actually pinpoint and target an area of the brain to create an emotion within their high-tech machines, and they also created like portable machines or helmets too, where the person could be programmed with VRs and actually feel the sensations. But basically, those are some of the methodologies, but the main purpose of mind control is to control individuals, to do a specific action, and to maintain the secrecy of a group. So that's a brief run through. Do you have any questions about that?
I think you answered most of that history. I guess I'll go off of what you said. You said a little bit of what they're used for. Why are these so important? Why is mind control so important to these generational cults / Illuminati, other secret societies?
Well, think about it. If without mind control, people would remember what they're doing, and that makes them a security risk, especially a lot of these groups have secrets. They're involved either in illegal activities to make money, or they're involved in such as trafficking or other things, or they're gathering intelligence. And they found that, let's say you have someone who you're using as an agent overseas to gather information, and that person actually is identified and questioned. If they have mind control and they're completely amnesic, truly amnesic, they can pass polygraph tests, all kinds of tests, and they will look innocent, let's say. But the main thing too is to keep the people in the groups. They have to use various forms of mind control, or else people would leave these groups. Because a lot of people, I mean, the methods are horrific they're used. I mean, a child is not going to want to stay and be involved. Most children won't in rituals and in some of the activities unless they were forced to. So this is a way of psychologically pressuring and forcing the child to maintain the activities that the group wants. It's basically for its continuance and for its secrecy.
That makes sense. And I think that's the part that a lot of people who might just start hearing about this, that's what's hard to imagine, is that there are things that people are doing that could potentially be so bad that they have to utilize these types of things to not just silence people, but keep them loyal to the families that they're in.
Oh yeah, yeah. And of course, the biggest part, what I think though is missing in some discussions of mind control I've seen, is the role of attachment. You see, oh, the bad guys hurt me, they terrified me, and that's why I was scared to leave. But that's early in healing. It takes later in healing to understand these are the people I love most on earth. And the biggest hold they had on me was the fact that I love them. You know, this is my father, my mother, my sister, my brother, my cousins, my best friends, you know, my lover, you know, whoever. These were the people I attached to growing up, the people who rocked me, nursed me, fed me, at least in some of the occultic societies, especially the ones where the child is raised in a facility, as I was. I was raised in a facility overseas. So the people that first rocked me, held me, and said, I love you, were the people in the group. My mother was a member of the group. My father was. You know, I did not know anybody outside of the group my first 3 years of life. I was not allowed outside of a facility until then. And so that was my whole world. That's why it's so hard to break free, though, too, because then in order to step away from a group like this, you are breaking your entire attachment you've created through a lifetime. And that's one of the most difficult things. And most people who are mind controlled, their systems will protect the person they loved most, they bonded to most on earth, because they love them. Love is a much bigger motivator than fear ever could be.
That's a really interesting point. You know, that's something, you're right, that's a very missing element to when people talk about this. Love, I think, is just in general, you know, that's the most powerful force in the world that we combat. And so there are ways
Yes.
to use love and to manipulate it and invert it. And, you know, we can think that something is love when really it's, you know, where does that line blur between like love and hate and, you know, love and violence? It's like it becomes so enmeshed when you have those relationships that are so, going back to programming, like, I mean, what age does this start? Very, very young for
Um,
a lot of children, right?
yes, it varies from group to group, but I know that what Mengele did and why he's called the father of modern programming, he initiated programming in the womb. Before him, the groups usually started the programming and mind control at about age 2 or 3. But what Mengele showed is that the earlier and earlier the child was indoctrinated, he started with infants, and then and then he thought, well, if an infant can be programmed, what about a fetus? And you have to remember that these sophisticated cult groups have technology that's at least 50 to 70 years ahead of what is available publicly. So they had sophisticated fetal monitoring devices. And so you could program a fetus in the womb. And what they would do is they would insert a very tiny, slender, flexible cord into the uterus. And they could shock the fetus to tell it, you know, if you ever disobey, this is what happens. And the fetus will just you know, quiver and shake in the womb. Or they can pat the womb, you know, and flood the mother with drugs that make her feel bliss and tell the fetus, this is what happens when you obey us. You feel happy, you know, things like that. So the operant conditioning actually begins prenatally for some of the more sophisticated groups, such as the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, the Knights of Malta.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to programming, two words that I think people hear, but they might not know what they are. Would you be able to just briefly describe what neuro-linguistic programming or NLP and hypnosis is? Because I know that that's a big part of this mind control too. And then we'll kind of get into, I'll let you talk about some types of programming that exist.
Well, NLP and hypnosis were used very early on, like in the 20s and 30s. That was used some. Mengele used it a bit, but basically, like hypnosis is when a person enters into what's called a trance state. It's actually a state of deep relaxation where the brain goes into, runs through alpha state and then slows down and slows down. And so the person feels very relaxed and some of their normal inhibitions leave, and then they become very suggestible. Neuro-linguistic programming is a bit different. That's more of like a combination of body language, sensory input, as well as an attempt to end words and other things to influence a person towards an attempted aim. And so sometimes like NLP will incorporate some techniques that could be think of as hypnotic. For instance, in NLP, you might have like a little laser light going back and forth, almost like with EMDR, but not quite, and you tell the person to track the light and while they're being given suggestions, but they're still awake. They're not in the trance state necessarily that you would be in, say, with hypnosis. But anyway, okay, that's a brief explanation, very brief.
Well, I appreciate that, because I think that, those are two things that have been, I think a lot of people have been exposed to those words over the last couple of years, and they might have an idea of what it is. But don't you think that between Hollywood and books, they make hypnosis look like this crazy thing that nobody does, and that it's this non-sophisticated type of, thing that wacky doctors do. And it's actually a very powerful therapy for good or for bad. I've also, you talk about how it can be manipulated in a really bad way with this programming, and it can also be super healing, which is interesting too. And a lot of people don't realize that.
I think so. I think you need to be with a safe person and be very careful who you do that with. But there are cases where people have described being able to get in touch with memories and body sensations and emotions that way. But hypnosis is a very small part of modern programming. It is used, but it's not a primary methodology used anymore. It used to be, but much less. The closest to hypnosis nowadays would be like if you're sitting in front of your television set and you're just like in a total, slower brainwave state and you're more susceptible. You're not really hypnotized, but that's about as close to that deep relaxed state that you are more susceptible to input at that point, though, than you might be if you were like alert and active and doing something.
100%. That's always a weird feeling too, whenever you do get engrossed and then somebody's calling your name off to the side and you're just zoned into the TV and you're like, oh, yeah, you were just calling me.
Yes. That zone is right on the borderline between consciousness and a very light trance state almost.
Hopefully that's relatable for people who are like, okay, I can't imagine what hypnosis is. A lot of people haven't, experienced it, and it's definitely not covered by any insurance. So it's not something that people go seek usually, unless, they might have extra money, or like you said, maybe find a good therapist who can help them with that.
But boy, I would be real cautious, because I've also heard of times when hypnosis was abused by someone seeking therapy that way too. So that's why it's always good to be careful about the practitioner. Check them out carefully, their references, and even if you know someone who's seen them, see what their experience was like as well.
Such a good tip. And I think especially survivors can probably really relate to that. That's something I get told a lot, is just how hard it is to find, and you mentioned it earlier, how hard it is to find therapists that go out of their way to study this stuff, because it's not something that, is even in their curriculum. So a lot of them are like, that's just a conspiracy, or it's what do they call it? Instead of DID, they call it fake memory syndrome or something like that, which is false memory syndrome. Yeah,
the false memory syndrome. Oh man. Well, anyway, that's a whole other topic that you don't want to hear my rants about them. But I will say the false memory syndrome, their goal was to target as many of the most effective therapists in the United States and get them with lawsuits. And that's one reason why in the 1990s, there were a lot of therapists working with DID and ritual abuse and occultic abuse. And then suddenly now it's called the satanic panic, which is a lie, because, and partly that's because of the litigation against the good therapists. So now there are people willing to work with it, but they're very careful how they advertise and the words they use. They might say, I work with trauma survivors or complex trauma, or CPTSD, but normally you won't hear people saying, I work with DID specifically, or it's rare. Now that there are exceptions to that, I have some links on my blog to people who I know of that either work with it or may know people that can be referred. And the ISSTD is a refreshing exception as well. That's I think it's an International Society for the Study of Trauma Disorders or something like that. Well, anyway, they do have a ritual group abuse study group with some excellent therapists in it.
And that's one thing I love about your blog, and something that I loved about your book. It's not something that I'm currently doing, working with clients, but again, to understand it, it almost helps to just kind of take it all apart, explain what it is, and then reverse engineer it so that way you can see how it comes undone, so somebody like me can have that big picture. And I think that's so helpful that you've done that, because I can only imagine how much feedback you've gotten from therapists and from people who are working with survivors saying, thank you, this information is really hard to find, for some of these really extreme cases, and breaking through all these different layers of programming.
Well, I'm doing my blog now to help therapists understand that this stuff is real. It's more directed toward therapists than survivors at this point, because those are the people. I guess I got furious when I found out what the false memory syndrome was doing. And that's why I share some of these things. And also because people don't realize how complex programming can be and how extensive the infiltration by these societies is. Although I think people are starting to get an idea nowadays. In fact, some people say, well, let's expose the Illuminati. I say, well, look at your local news and you'll see them on TV almost. It's so blatant at this point. It's no longer about exposing what's going on, but sharing instead, what do you do to heal? How do you help people who are suffering from this or who have undergone this and are trying to get free?
Absolutely. And I think it's even helpful for somebody like me who listens to these stories, even if it's just on a podcast and it's not a clinical setting. It helps somebody like me have better empathy to, even if they don't want to go into details or can't for whatever reason, or even if it's not in a podcast form and it's just maybe a friend talking about abuse, it helps to get comfortable understanding these topics, so when it does come into your life, you know how to wrap your arms around it instead of almost repel it or get scared of it.
Yeah. But the main thing too is, even on my blog, I just touched the tip of the iceberg, because mind control and programming are very big issues, and they're going to be very different for each person. So there's no one size fits all with this either. And I think that's important to realize too, that even though I share my experiences and some of my information, you may have another survivor whose story is totally different than mine and whose needs are going to be very different as well. But the basics, safety and attachment, I believe, are the common thread that run through almost all mind control done by organized groups.
Now, could you talk about some of the different types of mind control programming? You touch on some of them in your blog. The one that I've most recently dove into is the Jesuit programming, which was super new to me. If you could touch on some of those, satanic ritual abuse, MK Ultra, maybe a few of them, and kind of what are the differences between them? Do they belong to different societies? Maybe just a couple differentiations for people who might come across these terms.
Well, I think in one of my blog posts, I mentioned the hierarchy of the societies. Ritual abuse and occultic abuse and mind control, there's a huge continuum. For instance, you may have the dabbler some teenage kids who get a book about paganism or Wicca and decide to do a few rituals to go one step beyond Harry Potter, and then, and do some things like that. That's the local level of occultism. Then you have your generational families who may be born in Podunk, wherever, out in the middle, a small town, and they kind of own the town and their group runs that town. And people in that town all know that there's cult abuse going on, but no one really talks about it openly, but it's just there. Again, then you have your national groups like the Brotherhood and others in the United States, and who their members are programmed from childhood on too, much more intentionally. They have access to more technology, more funding. But then you have what are considered well, at least in the group I was in, are considered the 12 occultic societies. These are your international groups, and they include groups like the Illuminati, the Opus Dei, Magnificat, the Knights of Malta, the Templar Knights, groups like that. And some of the very well organized Asian clans as well are considered an international occultic society nowadays, because they have tentacles everywhere. So you have these 12 societies, okay? Then over them all is the Vatican. Okay, and now when I say Vatican, I'm not saying your average Catholic, by the way. Most people in the Catholic Church have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. You go to I'm not talking about your local Catholic parish where there's probably very good people there, where the local priest may be fine, but I'm talking about in the center of power at the Vatican in Rome. And that's where the Jesuit order is located. And the Jesuit order is actually the shadow government of the Vatican. Okay, so they are overall the other 12 societies. And so they
would you maybe say that they're the most powerful group, that they're up on top, or
yes,
is there a differentiation of how the groups under them look at them? Is it kind of a power
no
structure?
no they are the most powerful group. The other groups, I pay homage to them.
Okay.
And okay, so in other words, the Illuminati in America or Germany report to Rome, not the other way around. Okay, the Knights of Malta, which run Switzerland, they report to Rome. Rome does not report to them. Is that do you have any questions about that?
No, that makes total sense. Yeah. I think that that's always a question that comes up in people's minds, at least it did in mine, is, are all these societies equal? And they almost, like, I don't want to say compete with each other, but they're just separate. Or is there kind of a way that they all look at each other like, oh, this society is above us or this one's below us? So I appreciate you clarifying that.
Well, I think, okay, well, first of all, not all the members of these societies know about the Vatican rule, that they're over them. Like if you're Illuminati and you're like, mid-level management, you will have no idea that Rome is actually, that your top leaders are reporting to Rome. Okay. Or if you're Opus Dei, you may or may not know. There's going to be varying people. It's like the inner circle at the top know about it, but not your typical person in those groups. It depends. These groups are territorial. They've divided the world up into different territories and they rule them. So say in the United States, it's obviously the Illuminati. We're given most of the US. The Brotherhood runs parts of it and some of the other groups too, but they have a minor presence. Now, if you go into, say, France, the Templar Knights have a much greater presence. Yes, there's Illuminati there, but they've actually divided France up between the Templar Knights and the Illuminati there. Germany's run by the Illuminati. Switzerland's run by Knights of Malta. Magnificat is based in Italy and runs a lot and is over quite a bit of few of the wealthy families there. So in other words, they each have their region. So let's say that I'm an Illuminati member and I want to go to Switzerland and I have a mission there. I actually have to go to the Knights of Malta leadership and say, I have a mission here. and ask their permission to enter. In a sense, it's considered courtesy.
Oh, wow.
They don't want someone on their grounds operating without their authorization or their knowledge of what's going on. Okay.
Okay.
Or let's say that I am a member of Opus Dei and I have something that I need to do in Russia. I would go to the Russian Illuminati and ask their permission. By the way, I don't do that, but I'm just hypothetically telling you how it works.
Yeah.
So they work cooperatively, but they're also very competitive as well. Now,
because that's how just a normal cult is run, through a hierarchy. So that makes sense that they would structure everything that way, to where there's this group's the highest, or this leader, and everything is in a place under it.
Yeah. So if you go into another group's territory, it's considered courtesy and also common sense, just to let the leadership there know, I'm doing this. This is how long I'll be here. I'll be out of there within 2 months, blah, blah, blah. Can you, and can you offer me resources? And they might do that depending on if it furthers their group's missions. They usually do,
Wow. Now,
Yeah.
what's the difference between the types of programming that some of these societies use? Because the Jesuit, they have their own way of programming. Then there's satanic ritual abuse. There's MK Ultra, and you don't have to go super in depth if you don't want to into some of them. But what are some of the maybe major differences or characteristics that differ between those, for people who are like, they all sound similar, or I don't know what the differentiating factor is?
They're all pretty similar in the 12 international societies. It's fairly similar. I mean, since the 1970s, they each have their, there's genetic labs that these groups use, to create, improve the DNA of their individuals. And one group might purchase DNA from another, say for their fetuses, things like that. Normally, the Jesuit order usually has held on to the most sophisticated programming, but over the years they shared quite a bit with other groups, and Mengele did too, because Mengele kept extensive databases, and so Rome actually allowed him to share a certain amount with the other groups, to help improve their programming over time. But nowadays, with technology, with the sharing of information, most of the groups have shared quite a bit of information. Now, they each have proprietary programming that they keep to themselves, but in general, there's a lot of sharing of information because they want to improve mind control within their members. And so it's often very similar, not exactly the same, but very similar. Now, not all groups have their children, though, in, say, an institution or a facility for the first 3 years of life. That is a Jesuit thing. Some groups will send their children to these facilities for intermittent periods as they're growing up, but will host them in a family or two.
Gotcha. And is that generational, how they decide which child ends up where whenever they're born? Or are there certain things that they look for in maybe a mother or a child to determine if they're in a facility or somewhere else?
No, that's just like in the Jesuits, all the kids are raised in the facilities.
Gotcha.
In the Illuminati, they will send their children out for periods of time in early childhood for specific training, but the Illuminati tend to host their children in 2 or 3 host families. So you might have a child in the Illuminati who's hosted in America, France, and maybe another country, for their presentations. Knights of Malta have their own facilities that their babies go to for periods of time, and their infants. Again, so not all groups do 24/7 facility programming.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Now, along the lines of programming, there are obviously negative ways that programming is used, and ways that there are really horrific things used to install the programming into a child or whoever they're doing it to. Are there ways that programming can be positive, as far as, are there things that we can access within ourselves through programming? Are there things that have been accessed through programming that are actually positive? and that can be beneficial to somebody?
I'm going to, I get asked this a lot. And of course, I have my own prejudices because of my past experience. But in general, I think that when people say, can programming be positive? I think they're not actually asking about programming the way I'm describing, because what I'm describing is trauma based mind control and programming. Whereas I think when a person changes their internal thought patterns to a more positive one, I don't consider that programming. I know some, practitioners say, well, you're reprogramming your mind in a positive way. I don't look at that so much as programming, though, as because in my worldview, programming means the locus of control does not belong to me, but to an external person who is attempting to control me, to tell me what to do. Whereas when the locus of control is internal and I'm choosing to change the way I'm thinking, then that, to me, that is no longer programming, but it's actually a self-actualization or choice. So I think, are there methods that allow a person to self-actualize? Yes. I mean, that's CBT, DBT, thought-based therapies are all methods where a person can change the way they think and volitionally through their own choice change, but I don't consider that programming. Even though I know it gets bandied about, well, this is reprogramming the mind. Well, because of my background, when I use the term programming, say on my blog, I'm talking about traumatic abusive mind control, which is what the cultic societies do. So the groups I'm talking about never do, well, they never do positive programming as far as beneficial to the person, because their goal is to enslave and chain the person. Now, will they allow positive experiences that make the person feel happy, blissful, or whatever as part of their operant conditioning? Because there's always a reward? Yes. So they may give you feelings of safety, peace, happy, joyful, and that's part of their programming. But it's for a purpose. It's to control the person. I'll give you an example. In programming sessions in the occultic societies, an infant is often traumatically abused. But immediately afterwards, the infant will be held and cuddled, given a bottle, or breastfed by the trainer. They will be told, "I love you, and you did a good job," because they want to create the bond. And in these groups, the bond is real. It's not fake. It's not the person just saying the words, because infants pick up on that, and they're not going to bond with someone that they believe is just saying words. They actually do love the infants. And the infant knows that. And that's what brings the infant back into a more normal state from the awful trauma they went through. And the programmers know that. They use attachment. Now, is that a happy, positive, blissful experience? Yes. But is it used for a bad purpose? Yes.
That makes sense. That's a great delineation between terms. I almost feel like kind of the positive side, when people are stepping away from it, or maybe if they get out, or like you said, a person wants to change their mindset to positive. I wouldn't say it's deprogramming, but it's almost like you're shedding belief systems that maybe you've had, that you're changing, yourself, something that you learned, or, so I can see how that can be confused, and why a lot of people would ask that for you. Now, you mentioned that the abuse that you talk about is trauma-based. Has that changed throughout the years? I know many, many years ago, decades ago, the only way really to achieve that was to use abuse. Have they modernized that? Are they using technology? Are there ways that are less abusive than maybe what were in the past? Or have most of the methods been unchanged for the majority of time?
The methods are actually more abusive with the use of technology, in my opinion, because they now have the capability to take neural imprints from people who have had their arm sliced off, put it into a one of these machines, and then put the person through a VR, and it feels exactly as if their arm is being sliced off. So actually, it's much more traumatic and abusive in the negative forms than in prior years. The technology has made the abuse worse. And at the same time, the reward systems, they can now target the bliss center of the brain, the joy center of the brain, to create parts who feel a great sense of joy and bliss when they're doing some of the actions that they want. So
Yeah.
I believe, in my opinion, it's much more coercive and abusive than it was even before the technologies were developed. This is not a kinder, gentler cult world we're talking about. This is a cult world that wants to bring in their world leader. And they want they want people completely chained to him and to the goals of the cultic societies, and they'll do whatever it takes. And they don't want people breaking free. The good news is people do break free.
I know, and people like you are just, you're an absolute walking miracle that you're free, and that a lot of the people that I've had on my show, you look at the statistics, and you might know better than me, but I read somewhere that I think 7% of all people who get in these systems make it out, and that might even be high. But regardless, even if it is 7%, that's such a small percentage of people that even have a fighting chance of being somewhere to have a voice, or getting a home, or getting a job, or living something that resembles somewhat of a normal life.
Yeah, but people that want to get out have a lot of strength as well. And I believe God placed in our hearts our wills, and minds our will. We have a human will. We have a choice. And that's something that you can go through a lifetime of programming, and it cannot completely take away your will. It cannot take away that part of you that says, this is bullcrap. One day, one of your questions was, at what age do people leave? It varies. Sometimes people leave when they're teenagers. Sometimes they leave in their 60s, but it eventually comes down to the person waking up and saying, you know what, I've been lied to my entire life. They lied to me. And they lied to me because they believe the lie. See, and that's the other issue I have is, sometimes I read survivor accounts, it sounds like I was a poor wounded victim, and that happens. I'm not saying that doesn't happen in some cases. And they go, I was a wounded victim and the evil people hurt me. But what they don't realize is those evil people were hurt too as children. I have never met a trainer or an abuser in these groups that was not dissociative and had not been tortured themselves as a child. I'm talking all the way up the chain. I'm talking about the leaders of the leaders. People talk about the awful people who know what they're doing. When I was in the groups, I did not know anyone who knew what they were doing consciously. There's not this secret cabal of people who consciously know, oh, I'm hurting people. Because you cannot, as a human being, we cannot come into contact, I believe, with the deep satanic evil that these groups perpetrate and not dissociate. You go nuts otherwise, I believe. Or you would go into probably emotional shock of some kind. So from top leadership down, people are dissociative. But at some level, people know they're being lied to. We just have something that God put in us that says this is right and this is wrong. It is wrong to hurt children. Deep in our hearts, that's why infants are enraged when they feel pain. They're not supposed to. That's why your teenagers will try to sometimes run away from these groups. That's why they use mind control. If they didn't, everybody would be running away when they're 5 years old, or talking to their teachers left and right. So mind control is an attempt to silence that voice inside that says something is wrong and there's something better out there.
And I think for me, that was one of the biggest takeaways that I got from studying your material. It's not that I'm not a compassionate person, but it's really easy to look at what people are capable of doing and to judge them, and to think that they're in the same conscious mind that I am, and to think, how could somebody do that? So you automatically judge somebody. And not that there shouldn't be some judgment. Like you said, there's a choice too at the end of the day, and a lot of people don't explore the other choice or even consider it. They just bury it, and there's people like you who weigh both choices and say, this choice isn't as good for me as this choice, so I'm going to go with this choice. But for me, it's really helped me look at people, say political figures, or, a lot of the
Yeah.
people in the spotlight that get villainized. And again, they should be villainized for what they're doing, but to think that they're doing this consciously, it's incomprehensible that people could do that. Like you said, like these are unconscious human beings. These are
Oh
traumatized
yeah.
children that
Yeah.
grew up to traumatized adults that are carrying on something that was literally, like you said, it could have been instilled in them from the time that they were still in their mother's fetus.
Oh, yeah. You can look at political figures and see that blank, almost shell-like look on them, and you go, "Oh man, they worked hard on them to get them to do that." And it grieves me when I see that.
Yeah, and me too now. It's like I said, not that I
Yeah.
didn't have empathy before, but it's easy. Like I feel since learning through you, I have that emotional charge or that initial anger has been replaced with empathy. Like that's the first thing I go to is like that
Mhm.
poor person. And it's not that I agree with what they're doing or that like I endorse them, but it
No.
makes me think like, gosh, what did that person go through that this is who they are today as an adult or an older person or middle-aged or however old they are, like what's
Yeah.
their story and how sad that that's the result of, they never, how you said, broke free.
Yeah. At the same time, survivors do have the right to feel anger, hurt, and rage at those that abuse them. So knowing that doesn't mean you don't get angry, because you do.
Yep.
And do everything you can to stop what is happening.
100%. Yes, there's a way to feel both. It's so easy to get caught up in not expressing both ends of the equation and to just let that anger fester up. And I think that happens with a lot of people who aren't survivors too, who are studying this. They get enraged, and we need to have some type of, negative emotion fueling us into action. But we also need
Yeah.
to balance that through that compassionate effort of asking that question, like, what did this adult go through as a child to make them this person, to make them this unconscious today, or this evil, for a better lack of words, and your
Yeah.
material does so good, I think, helping balance out those emotions to make people say, oh, I really want to do something about this. And I feel a little bit more confident. I'm not as emotionally charged approaching these topics anymore. I have two
Mhm.
sides of the story. I can ask different types of questions now instead of just focusing on the ones that make me mad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, as far as you mentioned that somebody normally, it can begin in the fetus or at a toddler age that programming begins.
Yes.
People start to, I guess, recall memory later on in life. I'd love for you to go through maybe talking about the age that typically happens. I know it can vary, and for some people, it could even be earlier or later than an average. But and how have you, in your personal experience, and then from people that maybe you've dealt with or therapists who have talked to you about clients, what's the process of somebody recognizing or asking and being able to know, are these memories real? Am I imagining things? And kind of clearing the air for uh, that realization and that breaking free element of their mind.
Okay. That's going to be, again, different for each person. I mean, you could probably have several dozen survivors here, and each one would have a different process. But sometimes there's a common thread, though, is that niggling feeling that something's wrong. Even as a child growing up, even if they're amnesic, sometimes there's a feeling like all is not well on the home front, but I don't know why. Or the child feels really different, or the child feels has things in their life they can't explain well, but they try to explain away. When they get older, I once heard a description by someone that I thought was wonderful. They said, when a person has developed enough positive life experiences that they believe that they no longer deserve to be abused, they'll try to break away from it. I thought that was a great description. When a person gets older, and especially if they're intelligent or they have skills, but regardless of your IQ, that's not what I'm talking about, but and their innate desire to fight, they may say, you know what? I'm sick of this. For some people, it's an event that makes them just realize I'm fed up. I can't take it anymore. Sometimes maybe they lose someone they traumatically lose someone in the group that they loved in a very ugly way or as a punishment. Another person might see some signs of things to come in their group and they're not happy with the direction it's going. They're realizing, I cannot agree with this anymore. Some people just, they get sick of the hypocrisy and they're saying, why do we have to lie to each other all the time? Why do we have to abuse each other all the time? Why do we have to coerce and manipulate? When can I actually really truly love someone and it's not either a reward or a punishment based thing? So I think for each person, that moment is going to be different. But when they realize that I cannot put up with this anymore, I want out, or something makes them believe it's possible to break free. Maybe they meet someone that got out, or maybe they hear stories that make them realize others got out, which is a big reason for my blog and my book. The number one reason. Maybe they have an experience outside of their group where they realize, wait, not everybody is mind controlled. And when they have that experience in their life or that kind of thinking, then they will often internally make plans to break free at some point. And if they can keep that away from their programmers, their internal parts will start making a plan. And when they do that, the person will leave. And that's going to vary for each person. Like I said, if a person, I can't predict the age. I know that there have been studies that say, well, people that have amnesia, it tends to break in their 30s. Well, I've known people in their teens and their 20s and their 50s and 60s when it first broke. So I can't speak to that, But what I do know is that when the person receives enough truth in their life to realize that they've been lied to, and they have that strength of will to say, well, I'm not going to put up, I'm going to fight this with everything in me and get out, then they will. And they know it's going to be hard. Their presentation, their host may not know how hard the fight's going to be, but their cult host will know. Their back parts will know, this is, oh my gosh, this is giving up everyone I've loved and going into a world that doesn't understand what I've been through and trying to make friends and live in a world view that's so different from the one I was raised in. Those are the tasks that the survivor faces. And lucky is the survivor who meets someone who is willing to walk with them through that process. We talk about how hard it is for someone who's been trafficked all their life to leave the life. It's the same, only multiplied for a member who's been raised in a cult setting, I believe. Because at least our society accepts and acknowledges that trafficking is real, but there's a lot of denial in our society regarding ritual abuse still. So imagine the survivor who goes into their church setting or their support setting and saying, I need prayer because I'm trying to leave a cult group. And instead of with, we'll help you and stand by you, they're met with, you're scary, go away.
Or that's a conspiracy theory. It's not real.
Yeah, exactly.
Syndrome.
Yeah. And that is not the helpful response. The helpful response is to say, how can we help you? What do you need?
And I think the biggest disservice is the fact that people here in the United States, the only time that they've heard of, say MK Ultra, I would say is probably the most popular form or name of mind control that people might have heard, even if they don't know what it is. And even that, they said stopped in the 60s. So there's such a stigma around, oh, this doesn't even happen anymore. You weren't born way back then or before then. And, that was a CIA program. They didn't use test subjects. And, there's so much misunderstanding on that.
I have a response to that. How often has our government, do you believe, lied to people?
Exactly.
Come on. Do you really think that our Department of Justice and our government and the US government is telling the truth?
I know. That's the part that boggles my mind. I'm like, when historically have we ever not years later been like, oh, that was a lie, that was a lie, that was a lie. From everything,
Yeah.
even nutrition.
Yeah.
There's so many things that they've lied to us about, and we still, every time they say something, people are like, oh, I'm gonna believe that, like they're telling the truth this time. It's like we have an
Yeah.
abusive relationship with our government.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And I think that if anyone who believes that MK Ultra stopped in the 60s, that's when they stopped allowing Freedom of Information Act to retrieve documents, because the people had already retrieved the documents. It's been going on since then, but they're not going to open themselves up to further lawsuits. I mean, they've settled for tons of money behind the scenes with survivors in the past for what happened in the 50s, and I don't think they're going to. They don't want to open themselves up to criticism. So, what's the easiest way? Just lie. Just say, "Oh, it stopped. We don't do it anymore. We're good people now." And
Exactly
so,
right.
yeah, all the scientists that were studying little kids and doing those things, oh, well, they just decided to become good people and stop doing those nasty things. Right.
Right.
Not.
Right, exactly. Or after Nazi Germany ended, it all ended, and people just went back to their lives, and that never continued again. It's so interesting, the narratives that come up, and if they're told
Yeah.
many years, people buy into it eventually, especially as new generations come up. Now,
Hmm.
do you have anything else, or is there anything that you would like to say that we didn't get to talk about to survivors or listeners about anything that we talked about today, or is there anything that we left out?
Just that I want people to know it is possible to get out. It is possible. I'm not gonna, I don't want to make it sound too difficult, but it's a journey. Be aware that it's a journey. Um, if you fall down during your journey, ask God to pick you up or pick yourself back up. Keep trying. Don't give in. Um, Mind control can be broken. And anytime a person can find real love in their life, it really helps. Someone who's not part of an abusive group, anytime you can find a safe person who they will not totally replace what's lost, but who can be part of your journey, I really recommend that as well. That's not always possible. And if you don't have that, pray for it. Ask God to bring that into your life. You know, and keep searching for solutions, for options. The other thing is, I've been criticized for being too Christian, but I do believe that my faith is the number one thing in my life that helped me get out. Um, the love of God held me during some of my worst times. I would not have survived some of the memories I had personally without that love helping me through it. I know everyone's different, and maybe there are people who have the strength to go through trauma remembering without that, and I admire that. But for me personally, it was knowing that there's a God who loves me and cares for me, who is good. And by the way, how can God be good with what people go through? That could be a whole other hour debate on your show, and I don't want to delve into that right now. But
Yeah.
ultimately, I do believe he is good, regardless of what happens. And I believe that he is going to make things right one day. You hear a lot about, well, the Antichrist is coming, and the Illuminati are taking over the world. But there is a verse in scripture that says the government is on his, meaning Jesus's, shoulders. There is one who will one day govern with truth and righteousness. And it will not be the Antichrist. It will be the true God and his loving care. And that's a hope too that everyone can hang on to. Okay.
Okay. I love that. That's one of the things that I love most about your literature is you're very graphic and detailed with the truth. but you're so hopeful too in providing solutions for people like therapists and giving tools to survivors. And, even for me, I get a different perspective reading it to where I can not only have more hope, but more tools, and I can see the hopeful side of it, and being able to use the truth to empower is so important instead of letting it debilitate you. And I just want to commend you for that. And thank you so much for coming on here, Svali. It's such an honor to have you on here and to share your voice. Where can people
Thank you.
find you, and where's your book? Can you tell us about where to find your blog and anywhere else that you're at online for people who want to connect with you?
Well, I've got a blog. It's a WordPress blog. It's Svali Speaks Again.wordpress.com. Okay. And you just type in Svali Speaks Again, and it should come up. My book is It's Not Impossible. And but I've really tried to cover my blog. A lot of the things are in it too, because I feel this information is so important that people understand how this stuff works, and that it is possible to find healing. But it's on my blog, or on Amazon. You can find, just type in SVALI and you'll find it on Amazon. Okay.
I encourage everybody, please go dive into her blog, get her books. Like I said, the one that I have, Breaking Free of Cult Programming, it's helped me understand details of a bigger picture that I was struggling to put together in my head of, okay, I know that this exists, but what are the details, and like, how does it work on somebody or in general? And I believe nobody has done a better job at putting this material together than Svali. So Svali, thank you so much for being here. It's been such an honor to get to talk to you. And for people listening, thank you so much for listening. I'm going to link all of Svali's links in the show notes, so you can go down and just click here or whatever platform you're on to go connect with her and start digging into her stuff more. If you guys find value in this podcast, share it with anybody, share it on your social media, put it on your website, send it to a friend, whatever you can do to help us raise this algorithm. Obviously, these topics aren't the #1 pick on YouTube and on a lot of these platforms. So we depend a lot on you guys listening to help elevate these voices and these stories and to help us get the information out. So Svali, thank you again so much for being here today.
Okay. And thank you, Emma. All right. God bless you. Have a good day.
You too. God bless you too. And survivors, we see you, we hear you, and we stand by you.